Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. I hope all of you are doing well. So, today we are going to be covering the 1990s. And I'm not sure if any of you were around in the 1990s, much like the last lecture on the 1980s. Um, so some of this may be very familiar to you, and I would love to hear your comments if you were a child of the 80s, if you're a teenager of the 80s, an adult of of the 90s. If you were any of those things, I'd love to hear your comments, love to get your perspective, because I always think it's really quite interesting to um, to reflect on the fact that you were there, you were present, but maybe you not necessarily were, interacting with all of those events, or maybe you just heard about them, or maybe you were learning about them. So for this lecture, we're going to be covering a lot. So there is going to be quite a bit of information that is presented in here. But what I'm really going to be focusing on is um, events that took place around the globe and that affected the United States. So we're going to be looking at, a range of issues from wars and conflicts, both international and domestic. We're going to be looking at the issues of the economy. We're going to be looking at issues in terms of race relations. We're going to be looking at issues in terms of like music and fashion and, other aspects that make up the 90s, largely because I really just want to try to cover those areas that, you've probably heard about, but maybe want to just go a little bit deeper. But just to, let y'all know is that, this, trying to cover an entire decade in, in one lecture, there's obviously going to be stuff that we're going to miss, and we're probably not going to be able to spend as much time as we would like or that is needed. But hopefully, this can give you that basis so that you're able to continue to explore, be curious, want to learn some more about it. And of course, I'm always open to, discussing these, topics with you at length. So, feel free to reach out anytime via text or email or just, drop me a line. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on this. So, what we're going to be looking at, as I mentioned, so geopolitics, world conflicts. We're going to be looking at technology because, much like the 80s, that technology shift and change, which affects not only our abilities to work and produce, but to communicate. These are things that we're going to be looking at in terms of how it affects, society. We're going to be looking at some of the social issues of the period because much of what was happening in the 80s continues on into the 90s. And we'll be looking at some very tragic moments, around the globe as well as, here in the United States. And of course, we'll be looking at music, fashion, and media because, if anything, what's very interesting is that there's actually a strong interest amongst the current generations, this generation of, generation um, X that in terms of wanting to know more about the 90s, know about the because if you look at the clothing that is currently in fashion today, it has very much a 90s vibe. There's also an 80s to 90s vibe in like the hairstyles in terms of some of the ways that we present ourselves. But I think what'll be really interesting is looking at how those various music and fashion icons and the role of the media, how they've continued to endure. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's get started. Unfortunately, I'm going to start with some of probably the more difficult things that happened around the globe, but nonetheless want to be able to, draw your attention to some very, very key moments in the world. So, one of the most significant of the 1990s was the end of the Cold War in 1991 when Mikhail Gorbachev finally announces to the Soviet Union that essentially the party is over. And that's both euphemistically speaking and economically speaking, and, just straight up real that the system of communism was under collapse. Now, of course, as we mentioned in the lecture on the 1980s, that, under Reagan and his administration, it wasn't exactly clear what their approach was, whether they were trying to win the Cold War or whether they were trying to end the Cold War or trying to do both or neither. But it was clear even in the 80s that eventually the Soviet Union was going to collapse because of just of its economic policies, its systems. It just wasn't able to hold itself together. And in 1991, that finally happens. So what had happened in the 19 beginning in 1945 with the proliferation of independent countries, both in Africa and in Asia, that would happen throughout the 1970s. What basically was established in the Soviet Union is that you now had different countries emerging that used to be part of the Soviet satellite organization. So this means that, new countries are emerging. We have new forms of government, new forms of, organization, economics, etc. Period of chaos and instability depends on where you are. It really just mattered, in terms of like how exactly the forces were going to be managing. And I think that probably one of the best examples to, demonstrate that process of reemerging or coming out of Soviet influence can be seen in the reunification of Germany, which started in 1990. So, the reunification of Germany, just so that, to give you all some background, is that when Germany was invaded by the Allies, so the United States, Great Britain, and Russia, the Soviet Union, they decided that at the time when they were trying to figure out in Berlin, how exactly they were going about trying to reorganize Europe, there was a decision that was made that basically split Berlin into three sectors. You had a sector that was controlled by the United States, one that was controlled by Great Britain, and then one that was controlled by the Soviet Union. This partition eventually leads to a partitioning of Germany, literally between what is known as East Germany and West Germany. West Germany is the area that would fall under the influence of Western Europe and the United States. East Germany would be controlled by the Soviet Union. And that is culminated in the physical separation by the Berlin Wall. This Berlin Wall, you saw it with the speech with President Reagan saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The Berlin Wall became a symbol of not just the Cold War, but it was also a symbol to the German people about how they were separated. Literally, people who were caught on the other side, family members that were on the other side, brothers and sisters, families that were separated, right, friends that are separated, literally lived in two different worlds. And when the reunification process begins, what you see is you see um, how impactful the capitalist free market system versus the Soviet government styled controlled communist system were on these two regions. Effectively, once the reunification, excuse me, of Germany happened, the most alarming thing was what many people discovered in West Germany is how far behind East Germany was, not just in terms of technology, but development. We're talking about, major infrastructure, factories, the technology that they would have in terms of being able to communicate, the type of work, the, production, all of this. And so eventually what happens is that the reunification process, this takes, several years for East Germany to be able to catch up essentially to West Germany. And this is still an issue to this day. The lingering effects of this separation in terms of economic progress, in terms of social development, in terms of culture, it's still very different, right? Most countries that, take the United States, for instance, of course, we have regional differences, and there's differences between living in an urban area versus a rural area. But the problems that really existed for the reunification of Germany, while many people were finally happy to be one country, looking forward to this opportunity, building one country, one vision, the process was going to be much more difficult than just simply like, well, hey, we're all together now, we're one country. You really had to try to figure out how exactly you're going to get people who had largely depended on the state to decide what exactly they were to do for food or for jobs or for for their well-being, that now they had to begin to rely on themselves. How exactly do they go into jobs to which they've never been trained? How do they, get positions in factories or into resources that they have no skill level in, right? So there was going to be a lot of work that was going to be done. So those are some of the, bigger issues. So you have the end of the Cold War and you have the reunification of Germany. Another incident that happened starting in 1990, 1991 is the Persian Gulf War. This is what is known as, Gulf War One. And there's also, so what exactly happens is this, is that there is a conflict that is happening between Iran and Iraq, between the Ayatollah and between Saddam Hussein. And essentially, this uh, disagreement that they have is that Saddam Hussein finds that because of the issues that he has with Iran, that he decides that Iran, along with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, are all in cahoots of trying to be able to remove the oil that rightfully belongs to Iraq. This leads Saddam Hussein to decide to invade the country of Kuwait and to start a small war where you see, if you take a look at the documentary that you can click on here, is that essentially the United States, because Kuwait was an ally, immediately goes in, responds, and annihilates, the Iraqi army, pushing them back to the border in Iraq. And so what eventually ends up happening as a result of this is that during that campaign of when Saddam Hussein's troops are being pushed back, they go through the various oil fields and they set them on fire. And so this, creates this incredible, not only just, physical damage, but also environmental damage, where many of these oil, rigs are burning, uncontrollably for days, weeks, on end. And so what ends up happening is that the United States, along with other local partners in the region, eventually have to go in and cap each one of these oil wells, to stop the fires. And so this was, a huge issue that happened. But what it did was is that it brought us into one of the first of many, conflicts in the Middle East. It is not that the United States, wasn't involved in Mideast politics. Of course, we've been involved in Mideast politics. We were, one of the promulgators to get, the state of Israel, in present day, in what used to be called Palestine. Um, and so the United States has often been involved, but this is one of the first, moments where there's actual physical troops on the ground. A signal that, the United States is not only going to continue to be involved in this area, but they're going to continue to build up. So this was 1990 and 1991 was where the proliferation or the beginning of the proliferation of our military strength was going to be placed. So this is the reason why, like today, if you look around the region, we have air bases, established in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, in Kuwait, in Oman, right? We have, air bases all over the place, so that we're able to, get our troops, get resources, get whatever we need, into that region should there be an issue. So case in point, like the issue that is happening in Iran at this moment, many of our troops that are stationed there are under physical threat because it is quite possible that Iran can launch an attack. Given their capabilities, as we have seen in the past. So, the Persian Gulf War was going to be the one really signaled, America's permanent presence in the area through the use of military extensions. And that would signal our involvement in future wars that would happen, such as, the conflicts that would happen later starting in 2003. So up until when we leave Afghanistan in 2021, 2022. So, when you think about these areas, these are really these indicators where you want to be able to consider like, okay, well, how did we get here? How did we get involved? And that's really like with the Middle East, that's how we get involved. But what's interesting about that is that as mighty as our military is, it's very important for you to recognize that the United States doesn't have necessarily friends, they have interests, right? We may have an ally in Kuwait. But that's only because we have an interest in Kuwait. We have an interest in what Kuwait has as a resource, whether that is land where we can, park our planes and our military weapons, or it's that they have a resource such as oil, right? So, and the reason why I bring that up is because it's very important for us to look at like the other three major events that happens during this period, namely the end of apartheid, the Bosnian genocide, during the Balkans War, as well as the Rwandan genocide that happens. And so, if you think about this premise that the United States has interests, not friends, you always have to look at why exactly the United States gets involved. Now, take the recent event of Iran away from that, okay? Because the way that President Trump and his administration really go about, engaging in military conflicts, it's not quite clear to really anybody what the goals actually are. They've had difficulty trying to figure out, or to at least just to communicate to the American people, whether it's to remove uranium, whether it's to remove a dictator, whether it's to protect the people, whether it's to, stop like nobody really knows what it is. Prior to that, presidents usually, typically, would make the case to the American people. They would say, here's the reason why we are going to Kuwait. Here's the reason why we're going to Iraq. Here's the reason why we're going to be entering into this war. And whether it's, in the, at the Persian Gulf War with George Bush, or the Bosnian genocide, or the Rwandan genocide with under President Clinton, these are interesting aspects. But when you look at like the end of apartheid in 1994, did the US have like a role in helping with the end of apartheid? Certainly. Naming sanctions against the country. So, sanctions, as we've seen, like in countries around the world, when the United States places sanctions on them, that limits their economic ability, which can lead to low economic growth. It can lead to the inability to access certain resources such as medicines or food. This can literally end lives. As a sanction, which many people see it as, oh, well, it's a nonviolent form of trying to get a country to do what you want it to do without taking military force. But that doesn't mean that it's not impactful or violent, because the consequences of sanctions, like with the end of apartheid, certainly put the apartheid government into a position to where it was no longer going to be viable to be able to survive. But of course, it's also mainly the work and the resistance of people like Nelson Mandela and the hundreds of thousands of other, local leaders who were able to keep people active and interested and in fighting, these events. But it was also, apartheid ended largely because of the media also had a very strong role in this. That, much of the coverage that was happened in terms of the violence that an apartheid government, creates, whether this is, the Soweto, shootings and massacres that happened, whether it is the killing of Steve Biko, and how public, his murder, became, essentially, or the jailing of Nelson Mandela, all of these things played a role in bringing the apartheid government down. So, but the United States didn't send troops. It doesn't send people in there to remove the government, the apartheid government, to reestablish that, right? It's not, what happened in Venezuela is not typical, right? It's atypical, especially of the United States. It's not technically usually how we get involved. So, take away the last couple of years, let's look at the trends and what it was like. So you take a look at that. When you look at something like the Bosnian genocide, and I'm not sure if any of you, know anything about the Balkans War. But what I would like you to do is that if you have time, I would love for you to take a look at this wonderful uh, documentary. And it's basically Romeo and Juliet in Sarajevo. Sarajevo was the capital of Yugoslavia at the time. And let me just show it to you so you can hear it. Let me make sure the volume is up so we can hear it play. Here we go. The city was hosting the Winter Olympic Games. So many Mira salute to their home. Historically, Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, always been a crossroads of nations. A city that had tried to set aside the old hatreds, the embodiment of an international dream. It was a cosmopolitan place, a melting pot where Muslims, Serbs, Croats, Jews, and other nationalities had lived together for more than 500 years. Okay. So, and I'm just gonna, get you to, one of the other areas so that you can see, how this war actually happens. Um, so what happens, um, is that so this area, what is known as Bosnia Herzegovina, it's a region in what is known as Yugoslavia. Okay. Now, Yugoslavia is founded at the end of World War II by a dictator by the name of Marshal Tito. And um, what ended up happening during World War II, without going into too much detail about it, but essentially what had happened was this: is that um, you had a region of the world, and this is an area known as the Balkans, and this area essentially is filled with multiple different ethnic groups. You have Serbs, you have Croatians, you have Jews, you have Muslims, you have mixtures of people, right? And they've all been living together for several hundred years. But the area has often seen various conflicts along ethnic groups. And so what happened during World War II is that these ethnic groups started to fight for on various sides. So for instance, the Croatians joined with the Nazi fascists, and they worked together to try to exterminate Serbs. The Serbs tried to, get rid of, people who were Croatian. And so there was this smaller war that was going on, within a larger war during World War II. The ethnic hatred, as we'll see in this next clip, goes back a long way. We're talking, it goes back all the way to the 14th century, where Serbs who you had Serbs who were, trying to fight against Muslims, the Ottoman Empire at the time, and were trying to, take their own, place. They wanted, much like any group of people, they don't want to be oppressed. They don't want to live under the control of somebody else. They want to rule themselves. Fine, cool. Well, what you're going to see in this next clip is you're going to see an individual by the name of Slobodan Milosevic. He is basically the ringleader of this idea that Serbian people at this period in the 1990s need to reassert themselves, and they need to reassert their homeland, and they need to reassert and take the land which is rightfully theirs. Okay. Now, under Marshal Tito, he basically had outlawed all this. Nobody's a Serb, nobody's a Croat, nobody's a Jew, nobody's a Muslim, everybody's a Yugoslav. We're getting rid of any sort of this little partisanship, and we're getting rid of these identities, and everybody's going to be one nationality. We're all going to be Yugoslavian. That's how this is going to work. And if you disobeyed it, you got into some serious trouble. Okay. So it keeps the peace, keeps everybody, together. But as soon as he's dead, now what happens is this power vacuum. And because the Soviet Union is losing its influence, the Yugoslavia is now starting to see that it might start to break apart because of people like Slobodan Milosevic, who is going to be able to try to reassert Serbian's authority. Okay, so just go ahead and listen.
A small fisherman's store, stocked with products they buy on trips to Italy. Meanwhile, across Eastern Europe, communism was crumbling. But in Yugoslavia, an old force was reasserting itself. In an ancient battleground called the Field of the Blackbirds, 500,000 Serbs gathered to honor their 14th century war hero, Prince Lazar. He had fought the Muslim Turks at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, and his defeat had not been forgotten. Now, a militant Serbian politician, Slobodan Milosevic, used the threat of ancient enemies to stoke a rising Serbian nationalism with a call to reclaim their ancient territory. Igrom istorije I života izgleda kao da je Srbija baš ove 1989. godine povratila svoju državu I svoje dostojanstvo da bi tako proslavila istorijski događaj iz daleke prošlosti koji je imao veliki istorijski I simbolički značaj za njenu budućnost. Serbian threat led to a declaration of independence in 1991. War broke out as Croatian forces battled the Serb-dominated Federal Army. History seemed to repeat itself. The old hatreds reasserted themselves as forces from both sides massacred civilians. Once again, Serbs in Croatia were forced to flee. Among them, after her house.
So what's important to understand is that so there is no country in Yugoslavia. There's no such thing as a Serbian country or a Croatian country or a Muslim country, right? You just have ethnic groups, right? So what happens is that when Slobodan Milosevic starts to try to stoke these ideas that, hey, we need to get back at what happened to us 500 years ago and reassert our land and reassert our authority. This triggers fear from another group, the Croatians, who are living amongst Serbs. They're living amongst Muslims. They're living amongst Jews. Everybody lives with each other. And they decide that they're going to declare independence, create their own country within the former Yugoslavia. So this is where Yugoslavia starts to break up. So it triggers that. So then the Croatians are basically fighting against the Serbs because they are worried that the same thing is going to happen like it did during World War II, and that we're going to have more conflict. So all of the Serbs that are living in the areas where it's dominated by Croatians have to flee. So they have to leave this area and they've got to get to an area that's more Serb friendly, right? So what ends up happening is that there's actually a response by the people in Sarajevo is that they don't want this. They actually want to keep their multi-ethnic democracy that they've got going on, this leadership. They think it works. But watch what happens.
April 5th, 1992. Streets of Sarajevo were filled with Bosnian Muslims, Serbs, and Croats, demonstrating their support for a new, independent, multi-ethnic state. Sarajevans marched in the hope that they could hold on to their tradition of tolerance and avoid the bloodshed that followed Croatian independence. Suddenly, shots rang out. Bosnian Serbs loyal to a political party opposed to independence and fired into the crowd. A sniper's bullet named the first casualty of the Bosnian War. The siege of Sarajevo was about to begin.
Okay. So in this event of the Bosnian, why we call it the Bosnian genocide is that essentially what had happened was is that when the war breaks out and people have to start fleeing to various areas, as you can see the shelling of Sarajevo by the Serb army into the city. So these are just civilians. These aren't military people, but they're literally being um, fired upon. And so, people are getting, killed in these bombings. The buildings are getting, attacked, but they can't get out of the city either. And one of the reasons why is because the city itself is being, quarantined and blocked off by the Serb military. So anybody who tries to get out is at risk of getting themselves killed, if they're trying to escape. And so that's one of the things that this documentary demonstrates is that those two young people, one is a Serb, one is a Muslim, is that they, because of their context, they are able to try to be able to escape Sarajevo and the shelling. But what ends up happening as they are crossing through no man's land, they are shot by snipers' weapons. And the young man is shot first, and then the young woman is shot, and then she's able to crawl over to him and wrap her arm around him and dies. And it's actually very very sad. You should actually take a look at it, because what it did is it got people to really pause for a second to be like, okay, what is going on here? But once again, the United States did get involved, but not to the degree that uh, that you would say that we're going to actually stop and do this because you know what, it's not our war, it's not our conflict, it's not this. But here's the main reason: what do they have in Serbia that we want? What do they have in Croatia that we want? Nothing. There's nothing there. There's no reason to make allies of somebody because if there's nothing that you actually want. And so one of the things that you really want to take away from this period is that these military conflicts, it only seems that the United States gets involved is when there is something that they can get from it. And that really brings me to the Rwandan genocide, where you literally had, in this documentary here, it's called The Ghosts of Rwanda, and it's a fantastic um, documentary because what it does is it documents, what was actually happening, to the people in this area, to try to figure out like, the situation. And let me see if I can find one of the um, scene in the documentary that I think would be very helpful for you. Let's see, because this one's like a large talk in terms of the discussions of it, but there's a scene in this where they are trying to figure out how to get people out, and for some reason, I am not, so I may have to change the I may have to change this. Yes. Is this the PBS video? This one. Okay. You have to press this.
10 years ago, a small East African country.
Okay. So let me get this area here. Okay. 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 So let me give you some background. So Rwanda is a country that has two um, large ethnic majorities. One is Hutu and one is Tutsi. The Belgian colonizers who once controlled this region created used, direct rule and a divide and conquer strategy to create animosity between the two groups, right? When the Belgian colonies leave, chaos essentially erupts in the area. However, Rwanda there was a plan in the 1990s to try to keep the current president, who is a Hutu, to try to keep the country together and prevent it from going into a civil war. So you have the UN there. You have discussions. They're going to sign a peace treaty with there is a liberation front led by um, the Tutsis, and they're going to sign a peace treaty that is going to be able to make this happen. Now, many people want this peace treaty. They think it's a good idea, right? But there are extremists on both sides, both Hutus and Tutsis, that don't want it to happen. So what ends up happening is that to break off these peace ties and to therefore justify the massacre that would ensue over the next 100 days, there needed to be a fundamental change in terms of the leadership. So just listen to what happens in this. And because this is the one that I want you guys to see, I'm actually going to change it in the actually let me change it in it right now. While we've got it, let's just change it now. Oops, sorry. So what you do is you go here. Actually, let me do this right now for you guys because, well, I can't do it right now, but what I'm going to do is I will change it for y'all because I want to make sure that the right one is there, is there for y'all. So let me just pull that back up. Here we go. All right.
In central Kigali, a group of friends gathered for dinner at the home of a young American diplomat, Laura Lane.
We had a couple friends over, and we just sat down to dinner, and all of a sudden there was a huge explosion, and I didn't instantly, come to me what that was because I wasn't used to hearing those kinds of sounds.
And then at 8:30, the first phone call came in saying that originally the first phone call said that there had been a big explosion in Kanambi camp, which is just at the end of the runway of the airfield, the Kigali airfield, saying that it looked like an ammunition dump had exploded.
And it went from there's been an explosion at the airport to we think it's the ammunition dump at Kanambe that's blown up to it's a plane that's crashed to it's the presidential plane that's crashed.
Someone had fired a missile that shot down the Hutu president's airplane. Even 10 years later, the responsibility for the attack remains a mystery.
There are many theories as to who shot down the plane. I don't know if anybody has the answer to that. Was it Hutu extremists or was it Tutsi extremists? Was it done by the Tutsis as an excuse to begin the movement south by the RPF and take control of the country? Hard to say. Or was it used by the Hutu extremists to begin the genocide that took place? I don't know the answer to that.
That night, UN commanders were summoned to a crisis meeting at Rwandan Army headquarters.
We were heading through very darkened streets in Kigali, very quiet streets, and there was no one. The streets were just empty. It was like a ghost town.
They found a leading Hutu extremist, Colonel Theonest Bagasora, in control.
Colonel Bagasoro was the chef de cabinet of the Minister of National Defense and a hardline person. In fact, I considered even more than hardline. He was chairing the meeting.
Bagasora had once vowed to launch an apocalypse against the Tutsis. Dallaire insisted he step aside and hand power to the moderate acting Prime Minister, Madame Agath. Dallaire knew she would resist the extremist power grab and appeal for calm.
Bagosora kept saying that she's of no use. She never was able to garner her cabinet anyways.
And an officer that was sitting next to me stunk of booze. Started swearing in French underneath his breath about her various names, and we were stalemated.
So what ends up happening here is that the peace plan that was originally going to be put into place is no longer going to be put into place because now you have the Hutu extremists in charge. What happens over the next 100 days is nothing short than a genocide. Madame Agath, who you see there, she is ultimately killed. She's shot. Her twin boys actually managed to survive. They were smuggled, they were hidden away and then smuggled out of the house. But what ends up happening is that over nearly 800,000 people, most of them Tutsis, are literally slaughtered over the next 100 days. And this genocide was well known to what was going on. If you watch the documentary, there are Europeans that you can see. There are Americans that are there, that diplomat that you saw. There are European visitors. There are people who have businesses there. And what the documentary will demonstrate, and you maybe have even seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, both of these pieces illustrate the fact that when the military comes in and takes control of the airport, whether it is the French military or the Dutch military, whenever that happens, whenever the United States people get out, the military is not there to stop the bloodshed. It is not there to get involved in the situation, right? They are simply there to get the people out, the people who are not Rwandan citizens, and get them out and get them to safety. That's it. So, were we aware? Was the United States aware? Was Americans aware of the slaughtering that was going on? Absolutely. It was totally understood. Did the UN understand what was going on? Absolutely. They totally understood. And so what I want you to understand about the 1990s is that the 1990s really, officially, like it's not even a question anymore of whether or not the United States gets involved in wars for right or for wrong. The United States gets involved in wars when they feel like there's something that they can be gained from it, right? And being considered, the policeman of the world is no longer a status symbol. It is more of the interest that if there's something that we can get from this place, then we're interested in being there, which is very much the attitude that President Trump has. Why does he want Greenland? Because of the mineral wealth. Why does he want Iran? It's obviously because of the oil. Same thing for Venezuela, right? There's plenty of reasons why, President Trump wants to continue to try to exercise his authority in other regions of the world. It's because there's something that they want, right? It has nothing to do with the fact that, it's the right thing to do. That may sound good, like, yeah, we want to get rid of a terrible dictator who's mean to his people. Yeah, we want to get rid of people who have destructive weapons. Yeah, we want to do this. Sounds good, but the reality is this. The 1990s really gave the indication that the United States no longer has allies or friends, it has interests. And when it has interests, that's when it gets involved. If there's no interest in Rwanda, there's no reason to get involved. There's no interest in Bosnia, there's no reason to get involved. Is there interest in Kuwait? You bet there is. There's a reason to get involved. Okay? So if there's any questions about that, feel free to let me know. Okay, so the 1990s, maybe you've heard about this, the dot-com bubble, right? Well, for those of you who remember a time without the internet, there used to be something called dial-up. And, the internet was the conception of largely of a couple people. One of the men who gets the most credit for it is a man by the name of Tim Berners-Lee, who released, the WWW World Wide Web, right? And that you've heard this and, created as a public good, right? A space in which people could be able to share information freely, right? That was the whole idea behind it. And what essentially it was is that it was basically putting a technology out there for other people to be able to use and benefit. And as we have seen, as a result of this, the World Wide Web launching in 1991 spurs an entire industry of opportunities. Because at the same time that the web was, developing, the personal computer was much more accessible. It was something that people now had in their homes, right? It wasn't just something that you played on the Oregon Trail green screen, that I've seen on TikTok or Instagram, where these teachers are like, "Oh, I'm having my kids play, Oregon Trail," and it's these, kids that are, 6 and 7 years old, and they're just playing a game that, of course, is not like any of the new age CGI, games that are immersive. This is like a very simple, 3 or 4 pixels, to be able to, shoot a squirrel so that you can survive, right? Um, and so, the paralleling of personal computers and the internet really opens up people to this opportunity to access more information, right? To be able to spread out more contacts, to be able to create what we used to call chat rooms. This was people to be able to create, chat spaces for everything from politics to cooking, relationship advice, how to, keep your kids quiet, all sorts of things, educational spaces, politics, whatever the case may be. And so these transformations and this accessibility in terms of information began to change the way in which we interact with each other. That now there was an ability to be able to have an anonymity, right? To be an unknown, right? The only thing that somebody would know would be your handle, right? And you've seen these on these Instagrams where people, try to find these people. They're like, we're gonna find, big guy 2291, right? And then they expose who they are, they find out where they work and everything else. Well, prior to all of that ability to search and find, at ease, this period is when people actually were able to, without judgment, enter into chat spaces, enter into areas, enter into spaces where they could have these conversations and these interactions. I mean, and so everything that you would think that would be, in the mind of somebody like Tim Berners-Lee, or even somebody like Elon Musk, people who are very pro free space to say whatever you want, right? Well, that often brings forward some of the most despicable language, right? Despicable thoughts, despicable processes that are out there, right? And so you would have, group chats where people are talking about massacring Jews, or that the Holocaust isn't real, or that we need to get rid of, all people who are immigrants, or, black people, or whatever the case may be, right? So this is that first moment in our history as a human, species, where we're able to create a participatory space with an anonymity, right? Where we don't necessarily have to identify who we are. As that grows, as this technology grows, more and more people, invest, they create, companies, they create opportunities. And so this dot-com bubble that eventually bursts, in the mid 90s, it's probably one of the best exemplifying, pieces of popular culture that demonstrated the dot-com bubble is of course The Simpsons, right? There's a scene in there where I think there's like a badger or something like that Bart and Lisa are trying to get rid of, or they're having to deal with. And Lisa goes onto the computer and she says, well, according to whatbadgerseat.com, right? Like whatbadgerseat.com is a business, like, because com is for commercial, right? Like the fact that anything could become a business, because that's what the dot-com bubble was. Anything could be a business. You want to be a business that, does recipes or makes socks or tells what badgers eat, you could do one, right? And that's what eventually causes this bubble to collapse, in the 90s, that, in the early 90s, where, people were really just so excited about the technology that it could do anything, but then they also had to try to figure out what exactly was going to be able to be sustainable. But also, additionally, it's not just forms of communication that create an anonymity, it's also forms of communication that create the ability to record, maintain, as well as reach out with more convenience. So we saw telecommunications and mobile communications improve itself, right? You had, the cell phones themselves in the 90s, while not nearly as huge as they were in the 80s, they became a little bit more available, right? They're not nearly as available as they are today, but you could have a cell phone, that, was relatively, good in size, and it had a little flip on it like this, and you had to pull out the antenna and and you could make a phone call. But what it was, the sign was, is that these early phones, these early technological devices were, rapidly being produced. And the technology at this time was, very similar to almost like the beginning of a new industrial revolution, right? Technology was going to fundamentally change the way that we did business, the way that we did our work, right? You all are seeing it right now with the role of technology in terms of everything we do, from search engines to helping us remember to being able to store information. All of that is going on, right? That's a consequence of really where we were beginning in the 1990s. And so, when you have, various, pieces of technology, whether it's entertainment or communication, think about how it affects and changes you, right? The way that you interact with this, right? The way that you interact with the screen, the way that you interact in a chat space, the way that you interact with your phone, the way that you reach out to people, fundamentally changes and alters the way that we interact with each other, right? I mean, go on to any, bus at any, time of the day, and you'll see most people on their phones, right? Standing in line, waiting for something at the grocery store, you're on your phone, right? Which means that we're not taking the time to necessarily look around us or to interact with other people. And really, that's where this technology has affected us. So, just think about that, because it begins in the 90s. Now, apart from the global tragedies that were happening in the 90s, there were also a lot of issues going around on the world, as well as in the United States. One of the global aspects, was the issue of gender and equality and sexual politics. And, one of the things that I want to draw your attention to is that the 80s saw spaces for women expand, right? Women who had been previously told that, they had to marry a doctor, marry a lawyer, have a family, stay home, raise children, right? In the 80s, they were actually businesswomen, doctors, lawyers, right? And in the 90s, what we saw was this idea that, in many cases, people thought that women were making even further advancements. That, yeah, we saw more women running for political office. So you had like somebody like Dianne Feinstein, who, just recently passed away, but she was the senator from the state of California for, several decades, nearly my 20 years of my life. She was the senator. We saw this girl power movement, right? Whether that was in, notions of women in power, women in, positions of authority, women who were asserting their presence, right? But unfortunately, the what was happening in the 1990s, with every aspect of women seemingly making advancements, whether that was in careers, whether it was in leadership, whether it was in terms of independence, there was this almost like a tinge, an aspect of sexuality to it. The 1990s really had this linkage where women were often labeled and resexualized in a way that demeaned their achievements that they made and their inroads that they made in all of these areas. The term is what is known as bitchification. And you can take a look at the article that's on this link, and it'll give you some more details. But essentially what it is that the ways in which women were being presented in popular culture was that, yes, women can assert themselves, and women can be powerful, and women can be leaders and everything else. But oftentimes, the way that the media spun it is that it would spin it as like, well, yeah, she's a leader, and she's, an angry bitch who's on their way to just being able to rule the world. or, there would be this sexualization that women often use their power as a way to get what they want, but they have to use their body or they have to use their allure to be able to achieve that, right? And this was promoted by the media. This isn't necessarily something that women were, using for, for their detriment, because what was thought to be something that was honestly, an improvement, it was, seen as this issue, around the world, especially for women leaders. Like you can take somebody like, Margaret Thatcher in England, right? Her loss and her eventual, demise is that they often use this term that, she's just, this woman who's just completely out of control and won't listen. And, it's this bitchification aspect, right? She needs to be able to do X, Y, and Z in order to get, in order to understand how systems actually work. And so, think about, the 1990s as a period where, more questions about equality come up, more issues in terms of the roles of women and what they're playing in society, but how the positions of women were ultimately demeaned because of sexual politics. Okay. Um, Also, during this period, we see the advancements. We see immigration becoming a huge issue around the globe. Many of these immigration debates were spurred off of, whether it was the larger wars that were taking place and causing migrants, to move throughout Europe, or if it was the conflicts that were happening in Central and South America that would cause migrants to make their way into the United States. But probably one of the more controversial pieces of legislation that was passed in California was, this 1994 Proposition 187, which essentially said that illegal immigrants were going to be unable to use public services. So when you think of a public service, we're talking about things like hospitals, we're talking things like schools. So, this was, I mean, you think that, what Trump is doing is radical and, it's not because in 1994, this is the state of California that's pushing this idea that no, absolutely, you're an illegal immigrant. You shouldn't be able to go into a hospital and get services. You shouldn't be able to your kids shouldn't be able to go to school and get education, right? You shouldn't be able to use any of the taxes that you don't contribute to, which of course we know that that's completely not true. We know that immigrants contribute in taxes because we know that they work. So, this was just a misnomer, but what it was is that it it created major backlash, right? And there was a huge organization effort on the part of many Hispanic communities, not just in the United States, but around the world and around our country to be able to fight against this proposition because it was just one of the most mean-spirited pieces of legislation. Like just it's ground up in behaviors and ideologies that are just so negative and really just center on this idea that immigrants are not human. Immigrants are not people. Immigrants do not deserve this, right? That's where this comes up. And so Trump's language, he's just borrowing from something 20 years ago. That's all he's doing, right? 25, 30 years ago. That's all he's doing. So, and remember, he was around in 1994, might have been in New York, but it doesn't mean that he didn't watch the news. And it doesn't mean that he didn't believe in this or support these ideas. So, be very clear. Because the attitudes that were happening in the 1990s, people like to think that, the 1990s was a period where nothing happened, but that's just not the case. I mean, take a look at like this is where, people like Hillary Clinton when she ran for president in 2016, she got caught up in this, with the media accusing her of using the term super predator, right? Because in the 1990s, that's where this term comes from, right? It is this idea that because juvenile crime was out of control, there was a pseudoscience of, making this notion that these were somehow super predators who were going to be eventual killers because they're indicating, lack of moral control and lack of moral authority and lack of good sense at age, 13, 14, 15, which of course we know anybody who knows anything about psychological science or the development of the brain, that the frontal lobes or the parietal lobes of the brain have not been developed. And so the sense of, right and wrong has not been fully, formed. And so, but Hillary Clinton, the wife of Bill Clinton, the president at the time, she goes on and she's quoted as saying, like, no, these super predators, something needs to be done about them. They need to be punished. They need to be put in their place. Tipper Gore, the wife of Al Gore, the vice president at the time, same thing. So, yes, because why? Why was it? Why would she say something like that? That many people at the time were also just not totally sold on either. It's because it was politically viable for her. It was popular. She wanted to look tough on crime. And who's going to fight back? A 15-year-old? Nobody's going to fight back for that. It's easier to frame these individuals as something that, you know what, we don't want you, we don't care, so let's just lock you up and throw away the key. That is one of the things that is most despicable about politicians, is that politicians themselves are always looking for that which is going to benefit them. Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, all of politicians are the same thing when it comes to the military. We only get involved if it benefits us, and we're only going to say something if it benefits me. They don't have any real morals. They don't have any real positions or anything like that. You think Donald Trump actually really truly believes in anything? No, he's only going to believe in something that's going to benefit him. That's what politicians do. And so the issues that happen with youth and education, juvenile crime is one example. School choice is another one, right? Where this was where the movement really began, where parents should have the decision to be able to send their kids to private schools or to charter schools on public money. Still a controversial issue to this day. Okay. But what's so fascinating about school choice is that it only seems to be the choice in terms of something that's available to mainly upper middle class and upper class white people. Doesn't seem to be available to people who are located in urban centers. I don't see a lot of school choice options for people in West Baltimore. Okay. So, just think about that. Because that brings me to the other point of one of the biggest issues during the 90s was the continual deindustrialization of the United States, move from industry to technology, a move from manufacturing to services. And of course, the group that is most harmed by this is African Americans. So this is where we saw, a complete, gutting of many of the resources that were located in the 1990s in major urban centers, whether that's, places like Atlanta, Baltimore, Detroit, Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, right? Areas and epicenters where there are large Black populations, we saw resources in terms of employment, and then we saw, cuts being made to government resources to help sustain and to keep, families afloat. So this is one of the reduction in both of these resources severely hurt the Black community during this time in the 1990s. And then finally, LGBTQ, what we saw in the 1990s, while there was certainly a greater push for visibility, a willingness to be more out and free, not like it is now, but, certainly there was more of a willingness, but not without risks. And one of the areas where there was a major setback was with the Defense of Marriage Act, known as DOMA, where it was defined as marriage is between a man and a woman. That gets repealed in 2012 by President Obama. And the other policy that eventually gets repealed is Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where people who were same gender loving could not serve openly in the United States military forces. If they did, they could be, discharged. So, this 1990s is a period of, difficulty. There's a lot going on here. And what we'll see is that because of the major tragic moments that happened during this time, um, these are just some of the things that happen globally as well as, locally here in the United States. What we want to think about is how these issues, like if we look at domestic terrorism and crime, take a look at what happened at Waco in 1993, which was a result of what happened at, the combination of Waco and Ruby Ridge, 92 and 93, eventually culminates in the Oklahoma City bombing, which was perpetrated by Timothy McVeigh in 1995, which was the Robert Murrah building in Oklahoma City, is basically blown in half. 168 people died as a result of this domestic terrorism. And to be, just so many of you are aware, I believe it's, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's like 18 of the victims of the 168 were children. And we're talking about babies, because there was a daycare center in the Robert Murrah building. Was Timothy McVeigh aware that there was a childcare center? He said yes, and it wouldn't have mattered anyways. He would have still blown it up. So didn't matter. So we're talking about pure evil here, people. But essentially, what Timothy McVeigh in 1995 had provided for the country as well as the world is that domestic terrorism was real. Timothy McVeigh wanted to hit back at the federal government. That's the reason for, bombing a federal building, because of what he saw was government overreach, government oppression, government, chaos being implemented on people, regular people like himself, whether it was at Waco or whether it was at Ruby Ridge. And to be clear, Timothy McVeigh was a individual who was in the military. So, he is understanding of, these issues, and he did serve in the Persian Gulf War. But wasn't really understanding of why they were there and what we were doing and why are we killing these people, right? So there's all of these issues that goes on, but domestic terrorism in this country, tragically, is having less and less people take note of it. One of the reasons what we see with domestic terrorism is that it is often discounted for being something that is viably dangerous. I don't think I have to remind many of you of what happened on January the 6th. But that is an example of domestic terrorism. And domestic terrorism can lead to some extreme, hateful acts. Domestic terrorism does not always have to be just perpetrated by an outsider. It can be perpetrated by people who are insiders. It can be perpetrated by people who are in the federal government. Terrorism is terrorism. And so, the domestic terrorism of the 1990s, really sets the tone for other countries to be able to think about their domestic terrorism issues that are going on in Europe as well as in Asia. So whether that's, Falun Gong in China, whether that is, the bombings that happened in Japan in the 1990s. If you look at the Europeans, in terms of like what's happening with, the alt-right in Germany, in Ireland, right? These are all examples of domestic terrorism where you can see that there is a pushback from certain people within the country to try to instigate greater chaos, ultimately some sort of civil strife. Okay. The other major issue that happened during the period was the Rodney King beating in 1991. If you haven't seen it, let me actually play it here for you so you can see it. So you have to click and just make sure that you're okay with it. Okay, so this goes on for about 10 minutes, the video itself. So you can take a look at the entire thing if you'd like. But the Rodney King beating, this was a videotaping that ends up literally on the news and in every television in America. Everybody sees it. It is the equivalent of the modern day George Floyd, of what happened. You have a recording, you see the evidence for yourself, you see what's happening. You clearly see that this is despicable. Well, In 1991, you had a couple of issues going on. And what I'd like you to do, if you have the time, is to take a look at um, this documentary. It's called LA 92. And it's a National Geographic documentary, and it's quite good. It talks about, brief history of Los Angeles, and it talks about the tensions that often existed in Los Angeles between various racial groups, in particular, the role of the police department in Los Angeles, which was at the epicenter of this beating, right? You have four police officers, who are involved in, physically damaging this man over and over and over again while he's on the ground. And um, there is a trial, right? And the public outcry on this is huge, right? People, they see what they see. They're for years, for decades, people had known about, the violence that was perpetrated by the Los Angeles Police Department. It is well known to most people, especially African American and Latino communities in Los Angeles, as to how they are treated by the police. White people, less so, heard some stories maybe, but this is the first time that they're actually like, okay, there's clearly something's going on, something's wrong. What is happening here? So there is a trial. At the trial, unfortunately, the four men are acquitted. And what this just solidified for many people in this country, and in particular in California at the time, was the fact that racism was deeply entrenched in the police department in Los Angeles, and that the um, the trial itself and the acquittal, of these individuals by a jury outside of Los Angeles County. So they were in an area known as Orange County, right? More heavily white, more heavily conservative, right? So they took it out of LA County because of the fear that they wouldn't be able to be judged fairly. Well, they take it out of the county, and then this is what ends up happening, is that they are acquitted. This immediately ignites Los Angeles. For 1 week, there's rioting. And the riots, basically, the epicenter of the riots, it takes place in Los Angeles, in an area called beyond the streets of Florence and Normandy. Excuse me. Needed just a little sip of water there. But take a look at that. The riots were something that culminated in not just a greater recognition of the huge inequalities that existed in Los Angeles, but also the unease that really existed between communities, right? That existed between the Korean community and the Black community, between the Latino community and the white community, between the rich and the poor, between the haves and the have-nots, right? This really gave an indicator of to like where, Los Angeles was. And it inspires, various films, music, Tupac being, one of them, To Live and Die in LA, that was produced, right after the Los Angeles riots. It left an indelible mark. And on me in particular, because I was actually in Los Angeles when this happened. I was a little kid. I was with my father, who would take me on trips when he would go and my father was a salesman, and he would sell stuff to various like companies, basically like printing. And so he would take me on these trips, because he was like, school is one thing, but you need to have an education. And so, he'd take me to Los Angeles. And I remember us being there. We were because everybody was watching this trial. Like everybody was waiting for this verdict. And we were at an office building, somewhere it was in South Los Angeles, and basically like warehouses, business and stuff like that. And I'm just a little kid, I'm just sitting there like in the little lobby area, and there's a radio and there's a television, and people are listening to it, and I don't really know what's going on because I'm like, heard about this, saw some of the images, but I didn't put two and two together. And I just remember the room going, like this, this sound of just like when they announced the verdict, because everybody in that room knew exactly what was about to happen. And so immediately my father, says goodbyes to everybody, and they're just like, because my father, white, right? But he's all the people that, he's selling this printing to and everything else, everybody's, Hispanic, Black, Asian. He's like, they're like, you have to go. Like, you're going to have to get out of here, or either you have to stay here. But they were like, well, if you stay here, we don't know if you're going to be able to get out. We don't know if you're going to be safe, right? So immediately, my father, is like, says goodbyes to everybody and, throws me into the rental car that he had. Um, and he tells me um, get down, to not, because like my father was speeding, flying, because I guess what he was trying to, he was like, I was like, where are we going? Like, what's wrong? He was like, we have to get out of this area of the city. We've got to go, further north. So basically to where it's white, right? Essentially. And I remember, as we were going through various areas of neighborhoods and stuff like that, you could see people gathering. They were coming out, there was like anger, there's like groups and stuff like that. And I was just like peering over, because my father would keep telling me to get down, get down. Um, and so, eventually we get to, probably one of the, wider areas of, of Los Angeles, downtown, area that's not too far from like the current, I think the stadium is there now and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, and then we eventually, the airport was closed for a week. But my father decided to drive us the next day just back up to Northern California. And the riots went on for a week. We didn't have school. They canceled school in Oakland because there were rioting in Oakland as well. So, the Los Angeles riots were, once again, another indicator, much like around the world, of poverty, of inequality that was going on, and that people were just not going to stand for it. But in addition to that, which demonstrated the issues of race and inequality, 4 years later, you had the O.J. Simpson trial. And, this too was another trial that everybody was, watching and focusing on. But what it demonstrated, what O.J. Simpson trial demonstrated is how the justice system, right? The justice system, can be, corrupted, and it can be controlled, and it can be used in a way that gets you an outcome. If you have the right resources, if you have the right money, if you can tell the right story, right? If you've got people that don't believe you, in terms of that, right? Because depending on, especially in 1995, depending on who you were, like what your social class was, what your race was, where you lived in the country, you saw that trial in two different ways, right? I mean, that trial was so impactful that because at the time I was just finishing up middle school, and I remember us doing a reenactment of it as a group in seventh grade. And that's how influential it was. Like we all knew about what was going on in terms of, this trial. And, if you were one of those people that was watching it when it went off, you can take a look at the documentary here. You'll see that, it was something that was, hugely influential. And you saw like groups of black people cheering, and then you saw white people in disbelief, right? And you ask yourself, well, why is that? Well, the reason why that is because you had two groups. If you just look at those two groups, essentially, groups who had two different experiences with the criminal justice system, two different groups that had different understandings of how justice works and what justice is, right? And so, put aside whether or not Simpson was actually guilty, right? Let's just put that aside. if you look at the way the trial was run, how it was organized, the mistakes along the way, the ways in which they made their arguments, Johnny Cochran and his style, the glove that doesn't fit, right? You saw how impactful this trial was because it reverberated through popular culture, whether it was on Seinfeld with the bra that didn't fit, right? At that trial, if it's if it was like something in terms of the jokes that are made on SNL, right? All of those sort of things. So, think about that in terms of its impact, globally, locally. But additionally, and I won't talk about the death of Kurt Cobain, but, or the Columbine shooting. But Columbine, definitely very important because that's where we have these mass school shootings. Like this is the start of it, 1999. It's now become a standard, right? And so you ask yourselves, why exactly are these shootings happening? What exactly is going on? Is it just simply the access to guns? Is it just simply the access to mental health? Is it all of the above, whatever the case may be? But that 1999 was really, and I was in high school at the time when that happened. Um, so that was very, crazy. And then also the death of Princess Diana. That was a global phenomenon. Because this was a woman that was loved and adored, everywhere. It was like, Princess Diana's dead. Like, my God, who didn't like this woman? I mean, how could you not like her? Everybody liked her. Who cares about her marital affairs and her problems with this and her children? Who cares? You just loved her. And so when she died, that's that huge shock from that car crash in France, which creates, huge, fundamental changes and questions. But, finally, as we wrap it up, let's do it on a high note, okay? So, let's look at the music. Because if you're like me, you know, there's what is not to like about 90s music. Okay. What I love about 90s music is the diversity of it and the diversity in terms of the sound, the diversity in terms of the styles and approaches, the artists themselves, and also the diversity within the genres themselves. Take a look and listen, to some of those pieces. But I mean, sometimes Apple gets it right, when they do those, 90s, essential hits and stuff like that. That's okay. But I think one of the things that the 90s really was able to bring about was bring forward because of the technology and the ability in which to reach people, that you could have a lot more local, celebrities in terms of musical artists. Growing up in Oakland at the time, in the 1990s, this was an incredible time for you to be able to get local artists who would just, put their work on a CD, right? Because CDs were, big in the 1990s. And you could get them at the barbershop, you could get them at the corner store, you could get them anywhere, and you could literally listen to all sorts of music. And, especially in the 1980s, like in the 1990s, I mean, me being a kid from Oakland, who didn't listen to the Loonies, who didn't listen to Yuck Mouth, who didn't listen, to, E40 or, personally, like one of, one of my favorites. This is a man who has been rapping about the same two subjects for 45 years, right? He has been rapping about women and alcohol, and it's too short, right? But one of the greatest things about it is that, before, everything became so hyper organized and hyper sensationalized and, mass produced, you were still able to get incredible sounds. And, you could hear this music in, in people's homes. You'd hear it in clubs, you'd hear it in, bars, where people were really just producing in an emotional response to what was going on in the 1990s. And so take a look, listen to some of that R&B, those blends. I mean, the hip hop of the period, rock, alternative, pop music, right? Because all of these, musical styles also influence various types of fashion. So whether that's like sportswear and streetwear in hip hop, whether that's, minimalism, in terms of like, electronica or, pop, or if it's like the grunge movement from Seattle that's associated with people like Nirvana or Pearl Jam and that rock alternative and stuff like that. I mean, what's so fascinating about this period in the 90s is that you can link an actual musical genre to a fashion look, right? That, grunge is music and grunge is dress, right? Your sportswear, your hip hop style is also a musical taste. It is a musical performance, right? And what I find so interesting and what I've always loved about fashion is the fact of the way that it repeats itself, right? That, there's still various items, that that people used in the 1990s, that people are bringing back today. Like 90s was about leggings, and here we are, people wearing them to work, which I'm just like, I don't know how you can get away with that, but okay. But also like the accessories, in the 90s. I mean, chokers are making a comeback, scrunchies are making a comeback, the hobo bag, for women, fanny packs, but now they're like, you carry them on your shoulder like this instead of around here. I mean, it's fascinating to see the ways in which, the styles, reemerge, but the current generation puts their own little style on it. And I think that that's, fascinating. Okay, so that's it for that lecture. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to text me or call me. I'm always happy to answer. But I look forward to hearing from you.